Hello. In this video, we will look at Impressionism. Impressionism is a movement that bridges the gap between the sort of Romanticism of the late 18th century and modernism that would come early in the 20th century. It's a very specific movement. It's a movement mostly in painting, although there's a few examples of sculpture and photography that connect to it. And it is a very scientific movement. The goal of Impressionism was very specifically to attempt to capture the effects of light on a surface. And it was inspired somewhat by the discoveries and advancements being made by photography. Now, in many ways, Impressionism was a very revolutionary movement. The stylistically, in painting in Paris in the 1860s and early 1870s, the Salon, the Academy, had very specific ideas about what made painting best. And one of those had to do with the use of technique to hide brushstrokes and to create a surface of the painting itself that basically made the image appear to be an illusion rather than allowing the viewer to see the process of the painting itself and for the painting to have an impasto, a thickness, or a texture. Artists were supposed to use their skills to hide all of the reality of painting and make it appear to be just an illusion of a scene. The Impressionists refused to follow those techniques, and as such they were not included in the Paris salons. The leader of the Impressionist movement was Claude Monet. In fact, Impressionism as a movement is defined by this painting by Monet called Impression Sunrise. This is widely considered to be the first true Impressionist painting. When we hear the word impression, we tend to think about, it has many meanings, but we tend to think about the impression left by something. But in this case, I think what the artists were trying to do was to have their paintings be an impression of something. So, and not just any something, but a very specific moment in time in a landscape. Impressionism tends to be a landscape-focused style, but that doesn't mean that it didn't include figures. Now, for Monet, his goal was for his paintings to capture what he saw happening in light and color in the world around him. And as such, he tended to choose subjects that he was relatively certain that they would not change dramatically over time, so that he could go back to those scenes, he could go back to those places day after day, time after time, and they would be consistently at least similar, if not the exact same. So here we see the light as it reflects off the surface of the water. We see the atmospheric conditions and weather and clouds in the sky and the light reflecting off the clouds. We do not see an attempt to create a realistic image of the scene, merely to try and capture the spirit of the color and the way that the light works at this time of the morning. Now, Rouen worked in, not Rouen, Monet worked in series, and one of his most famous series were paintings of Rouen Cathedral. Rouen Cathedral was a very old, late Romanesque, early Gothic cathedral in Paris, or just outside Paris, and it allowed him to paint the same scene from basically the same angle or similar angle over and over. He knew that the cathedral was not going to change, and that it was going to allow him to create images that were very textured, that would have lots of light and value contrast and different color contrast based upon the atmospheric conditions. So when the light was bright and the sky was clear, he saw a lot of yellows, he saw a lot of ochres, he saw a lot of intense blues. And then in the shadows, instead of following the typical technique of creating shadows using black or dark colors, he recognized through observation that shadows were actually just deeper hues and darker colors of the same hues of whatever the local color of the object was. So he paints the same subject over and over. It's not about what the subject is. It's about trying to capture the variances of the conditions. And so here, the exact same scene, but definitely different conditions, different time of day, different weather, different lighting, different colors. And so that's ultimately what Monet and the other Impressionists were trying to do, was to show that it was these differences that made color what it was, and that as an art form, painting should seek to capture those and understand those, because it's going to make the artist understand the world better and be able to communicate and control his paintings better. Now, Monet's paintings are heavily textured. We see the broken brushstrokes. We see the thick, heavy impasto of the paint. We see, instead of hiding all that, he uses it to his effect. He uses it to create an image or images that blend together by the eye rather than through his technique. It allows him to work much, much faster and much more directly. So instead of blending all that color, he simply puts brush strokes of color next to one another and then allows the eye of the viewer to blend the color together to create the image. These works are very abstracted. They're heavily stylized, and they are definitely simplified. Monet's most famous series of works was of his water lilies. Monet's water lilies were actually he went so far as to have a pond and dug and built in his backyard, and he cultivated the garden and water lilies simply for the purpose of being able to control and manipulate the scene so that he could paint them whenever he wished. And he made dozens of paintings of the water lilies over the years. They really, I think what most people misunderstand about this series is that they're really about the water as much as they are about anything else. Because what's changing as he looks at the water is the reflections. When we ask, okay, well, what color is water? It's all relative. It depends. It depends time of day, depends on the type of water, the body of water. Is it moving? Is it still? Is it a pond, a lake, a stream, an ocean, a river? What is it? And then, of course, those conditions. So water takes on the colors. It reflects the colors of the sky, the colors of the objects in it and around it. And of course, it all depends upon those locations for what it's going to look like, and it'll change day to day. And that's what so enamored Monet with painting these scenes, is that they would change day after day. This is a photograph of his actual lily pond that he had built, including the Japanese bridge that you see in the background, kind of covered by vines at this point. You can visit it today. His house is a museum to his work, and and the pond is still there, and they preserve it very much the same way that it was when he was alive and making his paintings. Now, the other thing that makes the painting so interesting is his ability to use a variety of brushstrokes to capture very, very quickly, very simply, the different textures between the surfaces of the water and the leaves and petals of the flowers themselves. Monet's work was very controversial during his lifetime because this was the exact opposite of what most people felt like stylistically in the Academy was aesthetically pleasing. early on, he and his fellow Impressionists struggled for a market for their work, but didn't take very long for uh, patrons and to find the beauty in his style and the beauty in his technique. And today, Impressionist works are some of the most highly sought after in all of the art collecting. Now, this is from a series of 4 very, very large scale paintings of water lilies that he executed and that have become extraordinarily famous. The intense blues, the odd colorations, the use of those choppy brush strokes, all of that added up to a very specific technique and a very specific style that is quintessential Impressionism and Monet. Monet was the leader of this small group. It included artists like Degas, Renoir, who we see here, uh, and others who borrowed from and learned a lot from each other and from Monet as their leader. This is actually Renoir's painting of Monet, who is himself working on his painting. And that was a big part of this style of artwork, was that you went out into the world to paint rather than in your studio, removed from what you were seeing. They painted en plein air, which in French means on site or in the open air. And so they took their canvases and easels and paints and they went out into the world to paint what they saw. Now, Renoir's particular brand of Impressionism is really kind of specific in his goal to try and show how light varies depending upon the shade, depending upon how it breaks through the trees, and it will leave a different sort of impression on surfaces based upon how it's breaking and how it's falling. He was also completely enamored with Parisian cafe culture, and he painted very often these images of young people, like here, the boating party, or dancing, or celebrating just youth and life and the exuberance of that. So these works were not, well, as I mentioned, they were not as successful initially with the older guard of the academy, but they were very, very influential with the younger people, and who were entering the art market as collectors, because this time is time of relative prosperity in Europe, and so there's a great explosion of wealth amongst younger generations, and they're starting to get into the art market and to collect art with Impressionism. Renoir is famous for these scenes of dances and these large groups of people with the light breaking through the trees, and he was an observer of life and nature, and we see that very much in his paintings, in his style, that he liked to kind of watch the people as they danced and moved and mingled and related to each other in these large kind of outdoor scenes like these. Now, Degas was famous for his images of dancers. Degas loved dance and theater, and he recorded that and created these kind of almost fantasy-like images. Degas is also very interesting for his colorization. He uses an atypical view of color. So instead of purely using realistic color, we see a stylization of his coloring of his figures and backgrounds, and they kind of blend and merge together in this almost dreamlike state. But I think what's important about the Impressionists is that they just always keep coming back to observing, looking, seeing their time. They didn't want to try and create an art that would be popular or classical forever, or be kind of touched to the history and traditions of art. They wanted to try and make something that was revolutionary, that was new, that was different. And I think what's important is, because of their willingness to do that, they changed not only their own path of their own careers, but also they changed the role of artists in society. That was changing in the middle 19th century. The invention of photography had changed the need for painting to be the record keepers, but that didn't mean that painting couldn't still be relevant in terms of showing us what the artists see in the world and how they see it, because a painting sees the world differently through than a photograph does. A photograph is sort of sterilizes the image into, at the time, into just blacks and whites and grays, whereas painting could still show us a variety of different stylistic choices about color. Now, Degas was also a sculptor, and this is his Little Dancer of 14 Years, one of his most famous sculptures. And what's interesting about this particular piece is that he chose to cast the figure in bronze from life, but also to use actual dancer wear, to use an actual tutu, the actual bodice that would have been worn by a dancer. So he's not trying to just simply uh, cast or create the whole, an illusion of the whole figure. He's actually trying to create an impression, a mimic of what he sees in nature. In terms of impressionistic photography, um, photography is inherently about capturing light on a surface. It's about light that reflects off of surfaces and is captured by the lens. And I think that in that way, it lends itself to this style. But when we see, what's interesting about this is that the goal of these photographers is to try and make photographs that look more like paintings, that look less hyper-realistic than a kind of a typical photograph. So here we have a New York street scene, and it has been manipulated through both the process using of the camera and then in the development to create an atmospheric, more abstracted image of this scene. Now, we see some of the same subject matters, some of the same motifs in the works of Steichen and Stieglitz, the two leading, and Case Beer, the three, I suppose, leading abstract and impressionistic photographers. These photographs seem a lot more like paintings. They seem loose. They seem textural, not your typical photographic work. Now, for Edward Steichen, his goal was to kind of freeze motion. His goal was to show that moment, to capture a moment, not by manipulation and making it look more painfully necessarily, but also by using the ability of photography to, capture these effects. And so, again, working in and around New York and looking around at those very commonplace subjects so that it wouldn't be about a narrative based on the subject. It could purely be about the techniques. And he liked to capture these effects, to find things, as all photographers do, to see things that others don't see, and to see them with their camera and then show them to the viewer. The steam rises off the horses, and it's temporal. It's very ethereal. It's something that is only there. You're actually seeing the steam, which is a visual representation of the heat, of the change, of the moment. It will be different a moment later. And that's ultimately what they were trying to do, was to show that you could use photography towards this effect. Now, Impressionism is a movement that lasts for a very short time, but it's very influential. We'll look at in the next short video Post-Impressionism and those artists that were influenced by the Impressionists.